Today's World Insight with Tian Wei. China digs down deeper in its global development efforts, despite suspicions and trade tensions. What's the real picture? And a poignant look at China's restless youth from an American author who's a longtime China resident. What exactly do Chinese millennials aspire to be? Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our program today with the latest on the ongoing trade dispute between China and the U.S. It's been more than a month since the two levied tit-for-tat tariffs on $34 billion worth of goods. New U.S. tariffs in another $16 billion are set to take effect in 2 weeks, prompting China to retaliate in kind. What happens now with the global trade and multilateralism in limbo? And meanwhile, how will China go on with its development path with all of these tensions and pressure? Before we get down to the discussion, let's take a look at this.
The latest salvo in the worsening trade tussle between Washington and Beijing after tit-for-tat tariffs a month ago. On Tuesday, the Trump administration announced it will impose 25% tariffs on another $16 billion worth of Chinese goods. According to the U.S. Trade Representative, the final tariff list will target hundreds of items starting August 23. China was quick to announce countermeasures on Wednesday. It will match tariffs on the same worth of U.S. goods, which will also come into effect on August 23. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce decried the U.S. pursuit of domestic interests at the expense of international law.
The U.S. is provoking this trade war, and we do not wish to fight. But in order to safeguard the interests of the country and the people, we have to fight if necessary.
In recent months, U.S. metal tariffs have also affected its other major trade partners. The U.S. and Japan are scheduled to hold talks in Washington on Thursday over their trade imbalance. 2 weeks ago, the head of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, met with President Trump for a plan to defuse transatlantic trade tensions. In the midst of the debate over unilateralism and multilateralism, China has stuck to its policy of opening up. China's outbound direct investment and foreign direct investment have improved in the first half of 2018. The Belt and Road Initiative has had visible progress in African countries, Arab states, and European partners. China is on track for better economic cooperation with other parts of the world.
For more on the trade frictions and what is beyond when it comes to China's development path, we are joined in our Beijing studio Victor Gao Zhikai, a current affairs commentator, also the chairman of China Energy Security Institute. Welcome, sir. And also joining us in Beijing, Hannah Ryder, who's the CEO of Development Reimagined, who's also China representative of China Africa Advisory. Welcome to our program, too. Also joining us in Washington, D.C., we have Surya Gupta, who's a senior Asia-Pacific International Relations Policy Specialist from the Institute for China-American Studies. Welcome to you too, sir. Let me begin by asking you, Dr. Gao, about the latest development between Japan and the United States. We understand the bilateral trade discussions likely to take place at the ministerial level. And what do you make of the potential? It seems that both sides have different directions that want to persuade the other side to go. Dr. Gao.
Well, I personally believe it is a good development for the United States and Japan to restart their trade negotiations. We all remember very vividly that after President Donald Trump became the U.S. president, he actually walked away from the TPP, which was a major blow to Prime Minister Abe and Japan. And therefore, Japan actually has a lot of second guessing about what exactly the United States has in mind and how to deal with a very unpredictable U.S. president. So we need to give them more time to see how these two countries will reach agreement and how the agreement itself, or not, and how the agreement will be executed.
Yes. Mr. Gupta, what do you make of that potential? Any agreement walking toward the direction of TPP or things like that? Or it is very much different a potential?
There's absolutely no potential for something like TPP or something which is like a plurilateral agreement. It will have to be, whatever negotiations happen, have to be something in a bilateral context. The Japanese are unhappy about that, to be sitting in a bilateral context, but understand that at the end of the day they just do have to sit across the table from Mr. Trump and his representatives. So they are hoping to come away with something on the lines of what Mr. Juncker came away with about 2 or 3 weeks back. Japan is in a strong position to make aggressive demands because its weak link, agriculture, is no longer such a weak link in international trade negotiations, so it can leverage those concessions in that area to make strong demands in the auto sector, which is an area where Mr. Trump is unable to match the Japanese requirements. So they can take aggressive positions, but but my understanding of where Japan is going right now is just hoping that Mr. Trump will not make things any worse, particularly by imposing tariffs after a Section 232 investigation on auto imports.
Right. Mr. Gupta, if you briefly help us to understand further about the issue you just raised, which is the apparent verbal agreement, in a way, or consensus reached between the EU and the US side, which is not being followed up by actions because the EU economies have not necessarily agreed what with the president of the European Union said in Washington, for example, France. So therefore, is there anything left at all about that meeting and that photo op between Washington and Brussels?
We'll have to reserve judgment on that, I would say, for at least about a couple of weeks more. Here's the reason why. You know, the fundamental consensus that was reached between Mr. Trump and the EU Commission, ahead of the EU Commission, was that at this point of time nobody was going to make anything worse. They were going to suspend having any further tariffs. Now, if we remember back to mid-May, that was exactly the consensus that was reached by Mr. Steve Mnuchin and Vice Premier Liu He, and that was blessed by Mr. Trump in the Oval Office. Within a week, he tore that agreement apart. So at this point of time, what has been agreed, the consensus with the Euros, just about stands, even though the potential for any deepening of trade negotiations between the two parties, I would say, is frankly practically impossible. But if I could just say one thing, it's important to note that the NAFTA negotiations, the negotiations with Mexico, have a great deal of importance here because Mexico runs a huge trade surplus with the US in auto parts and in autos, and that is primarily Japanese and German vehicles which are exported to the US market from Mexico. And if those negotiations work well, then the need to really impose tariffs on German autos and Japanese autos might really not need to happen.
Well, all these pictures are actually quite intertwined with one another, but credibility is always one of the most important qualities when it comes to any negotiation in the world. Dr. Cao, your response to what could this bilateral talks eventually mean for the current chaotic situation of trade wars?
Well, when we talk about the discussion between EU and the United States, what agreed by Mr. Juncker and President Donald Trump, of course, Mr. Juncker wanted to do the best thing he could for EU. However, EU has a membership of about 27 countries, and each country has its own consideration. And I think President Macron of France said the right thing. Stop threatening tariffs on the automobile industry first. And then EU or countries like France and Germany will have better seriousness in talking to the United States. And I think this should be a lesson that President Donald Trump should learn, because unless he really stops threatening other countries, including, for example, countries like Germany, France and China, with imposing unilateral tariffs, no other country would take the United States very seriously. Right. Therefore, these discussions are discussions for discussions purposes. Whether they can reach agreement, whether the agreement can be honored, no one knows.
Right, and people remember very clearly back in the 1970s when the Japanese were negotiating with the Americans, and what exactly Japan get at the end of the day, particularly after so many concessions. It is almost nothing. And therefore, people know there has to be some attitude that economies must take in order to have a stance in a negotiation. Having said that, though, this is all big backdrop, Ms. Ryder, when we are talking about China's development path. Obviously, one of the most important stories these days is the trade war. Secondly, it is about China's outreach to the rest of the world, to Africa, to Latin America, newly developing and emerging economies, for example. Therefore, Ms. Ryder, given the pressure of trade wars, given the suspicions some of those might have about China's development path, what do you make of China's ongoing efforts so far? For example, in Africa, where you just came back from.
Yes, well, I just came back from Rwanda, where the Chinese president was there just over a week ago.
That's right.
And where even the impact of the trade war and these challenges is being felt. The US, for example, has just imposed some restrictions on Rwanda because Rwanda is trying to take a stance itself in terms of trying to improve its textile and garment industry, and because of these sanctions from the US, one of the factories which I toured, they've just had to close down 500 jobs in order to now switch to try and find some new buyers in Europe so that they can address this situation and still continue to operate.
So what people were saying there when they knew that it was because of the United States that cut the inflow of the Rwandan textile products, that these 500 workers have to, give up their job.
Yes, well, temporarily, hopefully. But the attitude is really, Rwanda just wants to stand strong. And I think that's the case with many other African countries. You see the African continent trying to make its own trying to make its own efforts. To globalize, to have this free trade agreement across Africa. And of course China has to be a very important partner for that. The factory floor I'm talking about is a Chinese investor. And actually with some of my partners from another organization, Made in Africa Initiative, we're trying to bring more and more Chinese investors into the continent, not just Rwanda but elsewhere. It's very important. There's a real possibility for the changes which are happening in Chinese domestic economy to have a positive impact.
Yeah. Dr. Gao, this is a very interesting and fresh case study Ms. Ryder helped us to do, which is when the trade war happens between the two largest economies in the world, what does it mean to the other economies, like to a small developing economy as in the African continent? What do you say about that? And therefore, what does that mean for China to work with these African economies, to work with the African entrepreneurs?
Well, first of all, the so-called trade war is not initiated by China. It's unilaterally launched by the United States against countries like China and many other countries. Secondly, China does not want to have a trade war with the United States, but once the United States launches a trade war, China will need to retaliate.
Right.
And no one in the world should expect that you can bully China and China will kowtow to you.
Having said that, though, what does that mean for the other economies working with China?
For the African countries in particular, I hope the choice will be very clear. Continuing supporting the globalization, promoting free trade, continue with the reform of the market, and welcome foreign direct investment, and participate as an equal partner to all these trading deals. And I think China can really share our experiences and lessons we have learned for the past 40 years, so long as you maintain stability and so long as you keep working hard.
And an independent decision-making process within the country itself, not being
future will be brighter.
Interfered by the others. Mr. Gupta, what do you make of this very interesting case study suggested by Ms. Ryder earlier?
Oh, I think China's role in Africa has been very, very beneficial you know, at this point of time, there's this big conversation of the Belt and Road Initiative and whether the Belt and Road Initiative is trapping countries in debt, or it's a foundation for them to grow and get rich and prosperous. The fact of the matter is that long before Belt and Road Initiative was announced, China was already a big capital exporter and investor in Africa. That was mostly in the resources sector, where governance, African governance, was very poor. In spite of that, there is the widespread consensus that it has been to the benefit of both sides. Thereupon now, what China is doing in Africa is basically trying to help Africa grow its own industrialization model. So China is not so much into the resource angle there as much as it is in terms of developing special economic zones which can provide the foundation for labor-intensive growth the way China grew in the 1980s. So from that perspective, China has been very useful, and it is important, therefore, that both African countries, China, and other developing countries deepen their commitment to globalization and also begin to use multilateral tools, or at least endow the multilateral system with tools which allow more stable environment for investment relations, so that these countries can all grow in a mutually win-win perspective.
But I'm not sure, Mr. Gupta, your view is being echoed by your president at all in Washington. Having said that, though, many believe that China's presence in Africa is a push for key infrastructures on the continent. For example, the Madaraka Express connecting the Kenya port of Mombasa with Nairobi was opened last year. The railway is being extended northwest Kenya, and there are plans to extend it even further. The Madaraka Express has cut travel time between Kenya's two most important cities from 12 hours to 4.5 hours rather. The railway is also spurring business around the stations with the real estate development, commercial and industrial parks, and tourism. These, in turn, are creating more jobs for the economy in Kenya. Of course, I understand that, Mr. Ryder, you originally were from Kenya. So you see that example. I'm not saying 100% perfect, the example that I just raised, but rather it is one of those case studies that people could put their eyes on and understand what exactly has been done. But Ms. Ryder, some were saying, well, maybe, you know, Kenyans do not need necessarily only 4.5 hours travel time from one city to another. They can just afford 12 hours. And therefore, there's no need to build a railway like that in Africa. You heard voices like that a lot. Sure. They would say, this is not economically viable, there are not many passengers, the Africans do not necessarily need that fast train. What would you say?
Well, the business case isn't proved yet, because actually that train needs to be going also through Uganda and Rwanda, which was the original plan, and hopefully that will continue, that plan will be stuck to. And so we also need the industrial zones to develop around the area, so that really what this train is not, it's not just to enable passengers. Don't get me wrong, passengers are really having a great benefit from it. Trying to get onto that train is really difficult. It's very busy all the time. There's only 2 every day, even though it's just 4.5 hours. But you know, you still need to try and book it well in advance. The key, actually, to making that train helpful for the economy is moving industrial goods. So it's not just about the train itself, it's also about Kenya's industrialization path, also the industrialization path of East Africa as a whole. And so it will take years before we see the real results and the real impact of this train. But nevertheless, it has been helpful for the economy already, even though, yes, Kenya is in a challenging debt situation initially at the moment. But that was always to be expected. It's kind of like taking a loan in order to start a new business. If you're always going to have a difficulty at the beginning. Right. But well, if you have a good business model, it will go forward. That is one of the things we mentioned, which is in developing countries, such as on the African continent, China working with the countries and companies on the continent. And the other thing, for example, in the Pacific region, many of the Pacific Island countries also have been receiving China's aid. Some
of China's aid has much exceeded some of the traditional donors in the region. Earlier was Australia, the United States, and Japan, but China's aid could be 10 times more over just the past few years than the original one. So some of those original traditional donors became suspicious about exactly what China wants to do, whether China wants to root them out of the region. Dr. Gao, this is in a way different compared to the African case studies. But on the other hand, there's certain logic there. That is, people see China try to work on a very good relationship with these developing countries. And they get nervous. They're afraid that their foundation, their base, going to be gone. Therefore, for China, it's not just the issue of trade war. It is only part of the picture. It's an overall suspicion about China, about what it wants to do.
Well, I think, yes, indeed, there are many countries in the developed world which are suspicious of the real strategic intention of China when it reaches out to many countries in the world. When we talk about Pacific Island countries, for example, the real fact is that many of these countries have been long neglected. There is a lack of infrastructure, and especially when mankind is faced with this prospect of rising sea level,
That's right.
and many of these very low-lying island countries may be inundated. Therefore, there is an urgency to help them to build up infrastructure and to help them to come up with alternative plans just in case, for example, less and less land will be available and more crowded the population will be. Therefore, if any other country, including New Zealand or Australia or Japan or the United States and Canada, for example, are really interested in the real situation on the ground, then come up with more plans to make investments in these island countries. Don't blame China for being more proactive in helping these countries. And I hope the taste of the pudding is really in eating it. Talk to the island countries' people and see whether they really want to have more infrastructure being built up.
Right.
I believe they want to have these infrastructures. They want to have the ease of the mind, not only in peaceful time, but just in case when crisis hits.
That's right. Mr. Gupta, though, does it really matter what the Chinese say? I mean, even though Dr. Gao and also Ms. Ryder have been very articulating about their own case studies and their arguments, do you think really Washington cares? On the one hand, it says, well, we're suspicious of China. We don't know what China is thinking. On the other hand, when China expresses itself, explains itself, Washington would just brush it off and say, well, maybe it's not telling the truth. So does it really matter whether China explains or not? When you see a country already becoming, quote-unquote, your rival, whatever that country does become evidence of why that country should be the enemy. Is it?
No, I understand the point. I think there is a basic pro forma necessity to try to be as transparent and just communicate your intentions. But at the end of the day, as Victor just said, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And one will see what has been done or what has not been done. And we have already had that proof of the pudding in the eating with regard to the African continent in many respects. When China went into Africa in the resources area in the early 2000s, the talk was all about neocolonialism, etc., etc. That talk has really dimmed down because right now, if you speak to an African, they will tell you how appreciative they are, by and large, about Chinese investments. And that's why I believe even with Belt and Road, in the initial stages, there's bound to be a lot of suspicion. But at the end of the day, it will be the projects which and their contributions to that domestic society and that economy, which will be the basis on which China will be judged.
Well, Mr. Gupta, I'm not sure whether you read news recently, but certainly that kind of accusation has not died down, as you earlier suggested. Therefore, I go to Ms. Ryder. We only have 1 minute left, ma'am, but your thought about this?
I think China can do a lot more to help African countries and others feel more comfortable. Bring out another foreign aid white paper. The last one was in 2014 and didn't break down foreign aid by country. We could have another one. That would be very helpful. It would allay concerns. It would help people understand what China's doing in different countries. Show China's ready to talk.
As simple as that?
Yes.
All right.
Several steps.
There we
That's
go.
first
We got
one.
some result today. Discussion. Thank you so much, Gao Zhikai, Hannah Ryder, and Sura Gupta. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program. What do Chinese millennials aspire to be? The author of the book on China's restless youth offers some touching and compelling answers right after this break. Welcome back. You're watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The real China lies beyond the Euro stereotypes portrayed in sensational reporting. It's important to ask, what is the country really like? What are the Chinese really thinking? What do the youth in China really aspire to be? Even though those questions have been asked by generations of China hands, they have become more relevant when China opens up and reaches out to the world. No wonder Zach Dishwald, a young American of the post-90s generation, set the record straight. After living and working in China, he put his life stories, including a nuanced view of his Chinese peers, into a book entitled Young China, How the Restless Generation Will Change Their Country and the World. It's an inside look at China's post-90s generation, which kept on dreaming and thriving. I invited Zach to CGTN for a chat. We started by talking about the so-called colored lens that some use to see China. Zach, what a pleasure to have you on CGTN.
Thank you so much for having me, Wei.
But you know, from time to time people question whether everybody understand the narrative about China.
Yeah.
Is the real narrative. Have you been consciously thinking about that question?
There's two different audiences. There's the narrative that we know from here in Beijing, and that's an elite narrative that follows the China narrative every day. And then there's the rest of the world. The rest of the world sees young people as little emperors, spoiled brats. They don't see them as incredibly talented students, incredibly talented thinkers, increasingly innovative young people. They don't see that. They see little emperors. They don't see China as an increasingly innovative space. They don't see people as independent thinkers. They see people as part of a large whole. Even the cover of my book, the first picture that my publisher showed me was a group of Chinese kids all in student gear. All from a distance, everyone looking more or less the same. They see a group, a mass of people. They don't see individuals. So to have a young person on the front of the cover who's thoughtful, who's thinking about the world, who's alone in a big city, in the West, outside of China, that's a new narrative, focusing on the individual. The born after 90 generation in particular is known as the me generation.
Right.
It's the first generation not as focused on the collective and thinking about, what do I want? What do I dream of? What do I want for my family? That's a different set of considerations.
Very interesting. On the other hand, there's the issue of, you know, the party, the state, and the individual in China. What is it like, that relationship?
I mean, this young generation grew up open-minded. They grew up with the internet. They grew up watching, you know, it's not just studying Western history. I have friends who can quote How I Met Your Mother, Barney from How I Met Your Mother, but also Martin Luther King Jr. They know our history. They've studied the West. They are far more fluent in our culture than we are of China, easily. 1/3 of all students studying abroad in America are from China. 2/3 of all passport holders in China are under the age of 37. You know, that's the born after 80 and born after 90.
Right.
So this young generation has seen the world. And more than any other generation in Chinese history, they recognize that, you know, everywhere has problems. Much more so even than the older generation. They recognize that America isn't that great. And China has its problems too, but at least it's getting stuff done. And it's getting stuff done at a rate that provides them personally a better opportunity than being somewhere else. That's powerful.
But as you may know, when China is getting much wealthier than it used to be, the growth rate is likely to slow down.
Yeah.
So is the changes of families and of life for the better. That's also likely to slow down. Do you think if they can take it?
I think this pride is more resilient than we give it credit for. I think young people are recognizing that it can be cool to be Chinese. It could be, you know, they can innovate internationally with the best of folks. When Jack Ma went to go have the largest IPO in the world, from a creative industry. In New York, that's a message to young Chinese who had before thought only Westerners or Steve Jobs can be innovative, that, hey, we can be innovative too. You're seeing right now that young people are willing to sort of stand shoulder to shoulder internationally. The older generation didn't have that same sort of pride, that belief in the strength of not just China as a country, but Chinese as individuals.
But now China and the United States is apparently in some kind of war.
Yeah.
Shall we say trade war? You know?
Yeah.
Do you think the Chinese young people that you've been interacting with, I'm sure during your book tour and stuff, you've been talking to them, your friends as well.
Yeah.
What do they think about that?
I think rather than focusing on the trade war that's happening this year, what people are recognizing is that now there's parity between the two countries. 15 years ago, if you were to say China and America are in a battle of equals, people would have rolled their eyes. That wasn't the case. There's recently on the Chinese internet, there's been a funny World Cup joke, which is 美中不足. It's an old saying that means within something perfect there is a blemish or an imperfection. But literally it means America and China don't play soccer. And so the joke is that Americans and Chinese, they're two strong, powerful countries. We just sit back and watch other people entertain us. But what that, you know...
of course, that's just a joke.
It's a joke, but what it sort of suggests underneath is right now that there are these two countries who are equals.
Yeah.
And I think that's what this young generation believes.
Despite changes, there are always things uniquely Chinese that pull back people to a lifelong commitment in China. The food is a big part of it. Zach, after living in Sichuan, best known for the world's hot and spicy cuisine, was excited to tell me about all the magic in the dishes. That's all a peek into a real life in Middle China. Chengdu is a place really you can enjoy yourself.
Absolutely.
Great food, great atmosphere. People just take it easy, as they say. I got two questions for you about Chengdu. First is, what's your favorite food?
First is 烤鱼. It's barbecued fish technically, but it's barbecued fish and then it's immersed in oil, and that oil is sort of slow cooked with herbs and spices. You have potato. You can add a lot of different stuff, and it's served in a hot pan. There's nothing like it that we have back home.
Going to 烤鱼 together with friends, it's really a big way for young people to hang out in Chengdu or in other cities across China.
Absolutely. My friends and I make jokes about how the older generation in China used to focus on eating bitter, right? 吃苦. And the joke now is that everyone in China just eats hot pot. On one hand, you have the older generation working hard and having to do delayed gratification. Chengdu is a great example of the want to 活在当下, to live in the moment. One of our favorite toasts in Chengdu is 今朝有酒,今朝醉.
Oh, really? You guys say that?
Today we have booze, so today we drink. It's a commitment to being here now.
The other thing is, what were you there for?
It felt like the world was getting China wrong, often focusing on old China versus young China. And by that, I don't just mean age. I don't just mean older people versus younger people. I mean, there's an older perception of China, you know, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, that isn't China today.
You wrote about young people, particularly young boys in China, thinking about their future, think about marriage and the real estate. And what is exactly the relationship among all of these phenomena?
China's property market is propped up on a marriage market. Different than anywhere else in the world, so many of the young people I talked to, particularly men, described the frustration of having to own property in order to be seen an eligible bachelor, in order to get married. It was that, you know, the ability to own property that allowed people to have allowed not just the woman in the relationship, but more their parents, that feeling of safety, that feeling of security. What that means is that they often have to borrow from their grandparents. They have to borrow from their parents. So you get this entire family structure saving money to support their child in order to buy an apartment. I think you're having some people bend to the pressure. I think you're having other people reinvent the wheel. When you look at places like Shenzhen, when you look at people, especially in the startup community, they're not buying apartments anymore because it doesn't make sense. The IMF recently had a report that came out that said 7 out of 10 of the least livable cities in the world in terms of housing market prices are in China. Right. 7 out of 10. So if you're a business person, you know that that doesn't make economic sense. but because there's a cultural imperative. Young people are still buying it.
So how is that having an impact, the so-called divide or gap of wealth having on the young people? Have you met people from very different social groups?
So one of the interesting things about being a foreigner in China, especially when you speak Chinese, is you can sort of hang out with a lot of different people.
Yeah.
So I've been on the side of the road eating xiaokao with, 15 kuai a person, and a Maserati will go by. And watching the faces of my friends change when they see that type of wealth, realizing that they're never going to be able to get that. That's something that they dream of. It's never going to happen for them. I've had that experience. The other experience, though, I've also had. I've been in that Maserati with one of these ultra-rich young Chinese people watching people on the side of the street eating xiaokao. And that person in the Maserati is describing to me how lonely they are. Because China has developed so fast, and really there's no international comparison for what China has achieved, especially in the last 27 or 28 years of my lifetime, that China's extremes are further apart, far further apart.
Some books on China not only offers knowledge, but real insight about how that country has been evolving on the ground. In the 1930s, for example, Edgar Snow, an American journalist, went to Yan'an and vividly wrote his interactions with and observations of the young Chinese revolutionaries in his phenomenal book, Red Star over China. Decades later, Peter Hessler, a Peace Corps volunteer who taught his Chinese students English in inland China, revealed to the world real Chinese lives in transition in his book, The River Town. And a few decades later, Zach's efforts in describing China's post-90s generation has become an important glimpse into China's challenges and vitalities as well. But Zach told me that even he is afraid to be disconnected with the fast-changing China. Therefore, he might want to move back again just to feel the pulse and the heartbeat of 1.5 billion people again. You saw different generations of so-called Lao Wai trying to understand China, dating back to the Edgar Snow, American journalist, young, came to China, tried to experience what is it like, and wrote a book, Red Star over China. You also see different generations of Lao Wai coming to China, try to write down their experiences. Most recently from the United States, for example, Peter Hessler,
Of course.
and Evan Osnos.
Evan Osnos.
Are you really that different from them? Have you ever thought about that?
What's interesting is that Peter Hessler's China doesn't really exist anymore. That scared me when I first got to China. I'd read everything that there was on China, especially focusing on Hessler. And when I went back to those places, they changed so radically.
Were you disappointed, or were you happy about that?
I was freaked out, honestly. I thought I had done...
That's a great phrase.
I really was. I mean, again, I wasn't planning on writing a book at the time, so I'm just like, I had done all my homework. I had come to the place to see it. I was ready to learn, and it was all different.
Actually, Peter wrote that book mainly as a Peace Corps volunteer.
Right, so he was a teacher in even a backwater of Lushan.
Exactly.
Even a smaller
So
place.
did you go there?
I did go there, and what you see is you see about 10 times as many cars. You see enormous high-rises. Most people there can start to speak Mandarin, so you're not. When he described the area, it was densely regional. It was even different than Chengdu. But what you're starting to see is the younger generations, they're not just paying attention to what their parents are saying or what their teachers are saying. They're watching videos that are coming out of Beijing. They're on their phones interacting with people from Harbin. So it's far more, maybe not global, but national. The conversations that people are having are not that different than the conversations that they'd have in Chengdu or even that they'd have in Beijing. And so we don't focus on generations as much in China. I mean, in China, there's a major generation focus, but there wasn't a new version, and there wasn't something trying to contextualize all of the change, especially in the last 30 years. Right. And I think it's, especially when you think of America and China, focusing on the people is what's going to bring our countries closer.
I understand that you're moving back to China?
I'm thinking about it.
Wow.
I'm thinking very seriously about it. Right now, I spend about half my time with China with my think-taking consultancy, and I love it here. I have much more fun in China than I do back home.
Admit it, you miss the food.
I miss the food enormously. It really is an issue. In New York, you're starting to have good Sichuan food, but it's not the same.
It's not the same. Yeah. But young China, as the book said. Will China remain young? That's a deep question, isn't it?
It's a really deep question. I think China is going to continue to start reinventing itself, or continue to reinvent itself. Young China has a lot of meanings. First, it's young people.
Yeah, sure.
Fine. But it's also a young identity. You know, this young generation, I call them the restless generation, but they're also the identity generation. They are deciding what it means to be Chinese in the modern world. They're going to be going out and interacting with the world for the first time as a China that's on a level playing field. That's an enormous responsibility, and it's something that it's something that's going to happen over the next several decades, not just in this 5 years.
Zach, what a pleasure having you here on our program,
and
I'm looking forward to learning more about the real young China, as you describe in your book.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Well, that is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Inside CGTN into your search engine. Check out our YouTube channel. Also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tianwei, and everyone on the World Inside team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world. Good night.